In 2017, a team of archaeologists at Uppsala University in Sweden published a paper that rewrote history. Not metaphorically. Literally rewrote a historical record that had stood for over a century. In 1878, a Viking Age grave had been excavated at Birka, Sweden. The grave was extraordinary, one of the most richly furnished warrior burials ever found in Scandinavia. 2 horses, a full set of weapons, a gaming board with pieces arranged mid-game suggesting someone who spent their life thinking strategically, shields, arrows, a complete set of equipment for a high-ranking Viking military commander. For 130 years, this burial had appeared in textbooks, museum displays, and academic papers as definitive evidence of the warrior culture of Viking Age men. The skeleton inside the grave had never been tested. When the Uppsala team ran ancient DNA analysis on the bones in 2017, they found something that stopped the entire field of Viking archaeology in its tracks. The warrior in the grave was a woman. Not probably a woman. Not possibly a woman. Genetically, chromosomally, unambiguously, a woman. A woman buried with 2 war horses, a full set of weapons, a strategic gaming set, and all the markers of a high-ranking military commander. And she was not alone. The Birka warrior was not an exception. She was the one we finally tested. Here is what the history books gave us for 200 years. The Viking Age, roughly 750 to 1050 AD, was a male story. Warriors, explorers, raiders, kings, earls, skalds celebrating the deeds of great men. The entire cultural narrative of the Norse world filtered through the lens of masculine achievement. And that narrative was not entirely wrong. Norse men did build the ships. Norse men did conduct most of the raids. Norse men dominate the written sagas. The historical record reflects a world where male action was the public face of Norse civilization. But here is what that narrative left out. Norse women, under the legal system of the Viking Age, held rights that would not exist anywhere else in Europe for centuries. The right to divorce. A Norse woman could divorce her husband by declaring the divorce in front of witnesses, 2 at the bed, 2 at the door. That was the entire legal process. No court, no church, no male authority required. The marriage was ended. The woman's property and brought into the marriage as her personal dowry returned to her. The right to own property. A Norse woman could own land, livestock, tools, and trade goods in her own name. She could inherit and leave property to her children. She could run a farm, and in the long absences of husbands on raids, she did not just run the farm. She was the farm, the right to legal standing. Norse women could bring cases before the thing, the community assembly that functioned as a court of law. They could testify. Their testimony carried weight. In cases involving family honor, a woman's declaration could initiate blood feud obligations. This was not the Mediterranean world. This was not the Frankish world. This was not the Anglo-Saxon world. In all of those places, a woman's legal existence was essentially mediated through her male relatives: father, husband, son, brother. In Norse society, she was a person, with rights backed by law and enforced by community. So if Norse women had these rights, legal standing, property ownership, divorce rights, and authority over the farm, why did history erase them? The answer is both simple and infuriating. The people who wrote down the Viking Age were not Vikings. The primary written records come from 2 sources. First, Christian monks and chroniclers in England, Ireland, and France, the people the Vikings were raiding. Second, the Icelandic sagas, written down in the 12th and 13th centuries by Christian scholars, centuries after the events they describe. Both groups filtered the Norse world through their own cultural assumptions about what mattered and what didn't. Christian medieval Europe had very clear ideas about women. Women were secondary, women were property. Women's roles were domestic and spiritual, and fundamentally subordinate to male authority. When chroniclers saw women with swords, running farms, or conducting trade, they either didn't write it down, or they wrote it down as something unusual. It was notable precisely because it was so different from what they expected. And in the Icelandic sagas, the same filtering happened. The sagas contain remarkable, fierce women who shame their husbands into action and plot with more intelligence than anyone around them. But they are almost always described in relation to men, as wives, mothers, or daughters, not as commanders or warriors. The Burka warrior changed that, because bones don't lie, and the bones said she was a woman buried as a commander, recognized by her community as a military leader of sufficient rank to receive a lavish warrior burial. Her existence was hidden by the simple assumption, repeated for over a century, that a warrior burial must belong to a man. The Birka discovery opened a door. Once researchers knew what they were looking for, once they stopped assuming, they started finding her everywhere. Across Scandinavia, archaeologists began systematically retesting Viking Age burials that had been assumed male based on the presence of weapons or tools. The results were staggering. A significant percentage of weapon burials previously attributed to men were, upon DNA testing, women. Not a small percentage. Not an unusual fringe. Enough to force a fundamental reconsideration of what Viking Age society actually looked like. Who were these women? The sagas give us a word: Skjaldmær, shield maiden. For 200 years of modern scholarship, the shield maiden was treated as mythology, a literary device, a romantic fantasy inserted into the sagas. The burials say otherwise. But the shield maiden was not the only female archetype being erased. The Völva, the Norse seeress, prophetess, and spiritual practitioner, was, in some ways, even more powerful. The Völva traveled between communities, her arrival treated as an event of importance. She practiced satyr, a form of Norse magic involving trance states, and she was paid. In a culture of barter, the Völva received formal payment for her services: food, shelter, gifts. Her word on matters of fate, on the outcome of voyages and battles, was taken seriously by everyone from farmers to kings. Odin himself was described in the sagas as learning satyr from a Völva named Freyja, the master of the gods learning his magic from a woman. That is a cultural record of a society in which female authority in specific domains was not just accepted, but considered superlative. And then there were the estate managers. The day-to-day administration of Viking Age farms fell primarily to women during the absences of their husbands. The keys to the farm were literally the symbol of female authority in Norse culture. Found in female burials across Scandinavia, she controls what comes in and what goes out. She controls survival. In a world where food stores were the difference between living and dying through winter, the person who held the keys held real power. Not symbolic power, not decorative power, survival power. Here is the part of this story that is easy to get wrong. The Norse world was not equal. Do not leave this video thinking that Viking Age Scandinavia was some lost paradise of gender equality. It was not. Norse women had legal rights that other medieval cultures denied women. Those rights were real and meaningful, and significantly better than the alternative. But Norse women also lived in a society where male physical dominance was the foundation of social order, where raiding, organized violent theft conducted by men, was a primary economic activity, where thralls, slaves, many of them women captured in raids, had no rights at all. The Norse woman who could divorce her husband if he mistreated her was a free Norse woman. The thrall woman had no such option. The shield maiden who could be buried as a military commander was a woman of sufficient social standing for her community to recognize her authority. The farmer's daughter, who had no standing, had no such recognition. The legal rights that Norse women held were real, and they were stratified, and they were contingent on social position. But here is the darker twist within the twist. The Burka warrior, whose DNA rewrote history, lived and died and was honored. She was buried as a commander. Her community recognized her as a commander, and then the world that recognized her changed. Christianity arrived. The legal frameworks that gave Norse women their rights eroded. Cultural memory was reinterpreted as mythology, and she became a curiosity in a museum display for 130 years. Listed as male, filed away. She was erased, not once. She was erased twice. First, when her culture died, and then when the archaeologists who found her didn't think to question their own assumptions. Her name is not in the sagas. We do not know what she was called. We do not know which voyages she led, or which battles she commanded, or which strategic problems she solved with her gaming pieces. We know she existed. We know her community valued her enough to bury her with 2 horses. We know she held rank. We know she was real. And for 130 years, the people who should have been asking questions were not asking them. Because the answer seemed obvious. Because a warrior burial must belong to a warrior. And warriors were men. The assumption was so total, so unquestioned, that no one thought to test it. Until 2017. Until someone finally asked the question that should have been asked in 1878. What if we are wrong? Think about how many other questions like that exist. Not just in Viking history, not just in archaeology. How many things do we know that are waiting for someone to run the equivalent of a DNA analysis? How many Birka warriors are still listed as male in museum displays across the world? How many stories are we telling ourselves about who had the power to change things? Stories that are only half the truth. The woman in the Birka grave did not leave us her name, but she left us something more useful. A question. What if the person we assumed was one thing, was actually something else entirely? What if the story was only half the story? The grave is still there. The bones are still there. There are hundreds more graves waiting for someone to stop assuming and start asking. She waited 1,000 years for her question to be asked. She can wait for the rest of them.